we are talking about social history and adding that to our family history projects. When we talk about the historical context of family history, this is a quote from 1957 in the NGS Quarterly. It says, "The study of genealogy is something larger than the particular genealogy itself. It is the history of a family in both its immediate relationship and its wider impacts on society. When the genealogist interprets his lineage of begats and begottens with perspective and presents it in a forceful literary style, he begins to delve into the meaning of the past and earn the richer rewards of historical genealogy." Like I said, this is from 1957. So this is, 65 years ago. And we tend to think today of adding history to our genealogy as something fairly new, but the concept's been around for a while. We may think of history as that boring class we took in high school. We took American history and European history and whatever other histories that we took. But when we talk about adding it to our genealogy research, we help to bring our ancestors' stories to life. What is family history to you? Is it a collection of names and dates? Is it how many ancestors you can collect? People are always like, hey, I've got 12,000 names in my tree. Well, I've got 30,000 in my tree. Is it just a dusty facts? Is it the research on your brick wall? Well, how can you make family history exciting and interesting for your whole family? When we talk about social history, we have to distinguish that from history itself, because history generally focuses on those lives of the important people and events and how they influence the world. But when we talk about social history, it focuses on the lives of the ordinary people, and it ties the history to our ancestors. Things like how people made their living, how they raised their children, what a household looked like, how world and local events affected their lives, why they settled in an area, and were they in the military, are all components of their social history. So why is social history important? Well, in order to understand our ancestors, we need to understand how their lives and decisions were affected by the events of their lifetimes. It gives us a better insight into our ancestors and helps us to know our ancestors more intimately. And it could help us find records that we wouldn't have thought about previously. And it's more than just the who, the when, and the where that we generally collect when we do our genealogies. It includes the what, the why, and the how. When we look at this, we want to consider a few things. We consider those general events and their effects. So we can consider things like diseases. Were they alive during Spanish flu, polio, or more recently, COVID, and how those experiences affected their lives? Were there important inventions that came into being during their lifespans? The automobile, the airplane, space travel, radio, TV, indoor plumbing, washing machines. How did those inventions affect their lives? Were there important military historical events? The Civil War, World War I, American Revolution, and how did those affect their lives? Did they fight? Were they in the military? And if so, what units were they in? Where were they based? And were there any significant battles that they may have fought in? We can look at their family life, things such as the average number of children, the average marriage age, life expectancy, and education all have effects on their lives. One of the things that's been coming up a lot in some of the things I've been listening to was the marriage age. If you were under 21 in many states, you had to have parental permission in order to get married during the 1800s, early 1900s. So that was an important thing. We can look at the economics of their life, their employment. Were they farmers? Were they industrial? Were they part of the WPA during the Great Depression? We can look at their salaries. Many of the census records and other records that we might find include their salary, their home values. Those sort of things give us an idea of what monetary values were during that period of their life. and the Great Depression or other major events such as that. We can look at migration patterns, the immigration patterns of groups of people, the causes of immigration, where they settled. We can also look at the role of religion in their lives. Were they Quakers, Amish, Catholic, Mormon? All of those sort of things would affect their lives also. Their language and ethnicity. Were they integrated into the communities around them, or did they settle in ethnic communities? Were they members of organizations such as fraternal, civic, or social organizations? We can learn about those by checking their obituaries or even reading the symbolism on their headstones. And then naming conventions. Were they named after their grandfather or grandmother? Did they reuse names of deceased children? What was the naming convention? And that'll help you understand relationships. So let's take an example such as immigration and look at how the social history affects that. So there are many reasons people immigrated. A lot of times we look at the record and it says the family immigrated in 1832 or 1850 or 1880. Well, that's great. And then we also research, they immigrated into Castle Garden or Ellis Island or New Orleans. But that's only a part of the story. The other part, and maybe more importantly to their story, is why they immigrated. Was it crop failures or famine? Was it the search for land? Maybe it was jobs or economic opportunity. Maybe the taxes were going up in their country and they wanted to escape that. Or maybe they were involved in wars. It could possibly be because of religious freedom or racial and political persecution or a natural disaster. Each of those things has an effect on their life, and that part of their history is important to tell their story. Looking at immigration, we can look at people migrating to specific areas. Why did they settle where they settled? Was it because the climate and the land were similar to their homeland? Was it because others from their homeland had already settled in the area and they were joining their community? Was it because transportation routes led to an area? Were the rivers there, the railroads, the canals, or whatever it might be, important transportation routes that they settled in those areas because that's where they ended up being? So when we start to build the stories by including social history, we want to avoid fictionalizing. If you don't have the facts, you can infer or generalize based on the events, but make sure you state that. Don't say that your grandfather fought in World War II if all you have is his draft registration card. That doesn't mean he fought, it just means he registered. But you can say that it was likely that many of the people he knew ended up fighting during World War II and how that might have affected their community. And don't say that he drove a Model T Ford unless you have the evidence. You can say that the Model T Ford was invented during his life and that he likely experienced the change from horse and buggy to automotives. You want to make sure you're telling the truthful story. For example, one of the relatives that I recently researched, he had moved from a farm into a community and he established a livery stable there in the community. 3 years later, he had the first car dealership in that community. So he went from the livery stable business to selling automobiles, and that was, his life. And that automobile company's transferred down to his son and then his grandson, and it's still in the family. So I was able to tell that story, based on the facts. When you start gathering the social history and the information associated with your ancestors, you don't need to cover their entire life. You want to record these things. You want to produce stories so that your relatives, your family can learn about them, but you want to consider in-depth narratives about a portion of their life, such as occupations, military, immigration, so on. And that's probably a lot better than, having a short, detailed story is better than having a long, rambling narrative. How many people are going to read a 15-page story about everything that happened in somebody's life compared to, here's a page about his occupation. Here's a page about his courtship with his wife. Here's a page about his military history. You can break it up into bite-sized stories, and it makes it easier for people to read and more enjoyable to pass on the information.